The other wives, who were either the cousins or the sisters of the king, were less richly dressed but much younger. They walked behind her, ready to fulfill, at a sign from their master, their duties as human furniture. These unfortunate beings were really nothing else. If the king wished to sit down, two of these women bent toward the earth and served him for a chair, while his feet rested on the bodies of some others, as if on an ebony carpet. In Mornilaunga's suite came his officers, his captains, and his magicians. A remarkable thing about these savages, who staggered like their master, was that each lacked a part of his body. One an ear, another an eye, this one the nose, that one the hand. Not one was whole. That is because they apply only two kinds of punishment in Kazond, mutilation or death, all at the caprice of the king. For the least fault, some amputation, and the most cruelly punished are those whose ears are cut off, because they can no longer wear rings in their ears. The captains of the Kililos, governors of districts, hereditary or named for 4 years, wore hats of zebra skin and red vests for their whole uniform. Their hands brandished long palm canes, steeped at one end with charmed drugs. As to the soldiers, they had for offensive and defensive weapons, bows, of which the wood, twined with the cord, was ornamented with fringes, knives, whetted with a serpent's tongue, broad and long lances, shields of palm wood, decorated in arabesque style. For what there was of uniform, properly so called, it cost His Majesty's treasury absolutely nothing. Finally, the kind's cordage comprised, in the last place, the court magicians and the instrumentalists. The sorcerers, the mgangas, are the doctors of the country. These savages attach an absolute faith to divinatory services, to incantations, to the fetishes, clay figures stained with white and red, representing fantastic animals or figures of men and women cut out of whole wood. For the rest, those magicians were not less mutilated than the other courtiers, and doubtless the monarch paid them in this way for the cures that did not succeed. The instrumentalists, men or women, made sharp rattles whiz, noisy drums sound or shudder under small sticks terminated by a caoutchouc ball, marimhas, kinds of dulcimers formed of 2 rows of gourds of various dimensions, the whole very deafening for anyone who does not possess a pair of African ears. Above this crowd, which composed the royal cordage, waved some flags and standards. Then at the ends of spears the bleached skulls of the rival chiefs whom Moinilaunga had vanquished. When the king had quitted his palanquin, acclamations burst forth from all sides. The soldiers of the caravan discharged their old guns, the low detonations of which were but little louder than the vociferations of the crowd. The overseers, after rubbing their black noses with cinnabar powder, which they carried in a sack, bowed to the ground. Then Alves, advancing in his turn, handed the king a supply of fresh tobacco, soothing herb, as they call it in the country. Monilaunga had great need of being soothed, for he was, they did not know why, in a very bad humor. At the same time Alves, Coimbra, Ibn Hamis, and the Arab traders, or mongrels, came to pay their court to the powerful sovereign of Kazond. Marhaba, said the Arabs, which is their word of welcome in the language of Central Africa. Others clapped their hands and bowed to the ground. Some daubed themselves with mud, and gave signs of the greatest servility to this hideous majesty. Monilaunga hardly looked at all these people, and walked, keeping his limbs apart, as if the ground were rolling and pitching. He walked in this manner, or rather he rolled in the midst of waves of slaves, and if the traders feared that he might take a notion to apportion some of the prisoners to himself, the latter would no less dread falling into the power of such a brute. Negoro had not left Alves for a moment, and in his company presented his homage to the king. Both conversed in the native language, if, however, that word converse can be used of a conversation in which Moinilaunga only took part by monosyllables that hardly found a passage through his drunken lips. And still, did he not ask his friend, Alves, to renew his supply of brandy just exhausted by large libations? King Launga is welcome to the market of Kazond, said the trader. I am thirsty, replied the monarch. He will take his part in the business of the great Laconi, added Alves. Drink, replied Moinilaunga. My friend Negoro is happy to see the king of Kazond again, after such a long absence. Drink, repeated the drunkard, whose whole person gave forth a disgusting odor of alcohol. Well, some pombe, some mead, exclaimed Jose Antonio Alves, like a man who well knew what Moinilaunga wanted. No, no, replied the king, my friend Alves is brandy, and for each drop of his firewater I shall give him. A drop of blood from a white man, exclaimed Negoro, after making a sign to Alves, which the latter understood and approved. A white man put a white man to death, repeated Mornilonga, whose ferocious instincts were aroused by the Portuguese's proposition. One of Alves's agents has been killed by this white man, returned Negoro. Yes, my agent Harris, replied the traitor, and his death must be avenged. Send that white man to King Masongo, on the upper Zaire among the Assonas. They will cut him in pieces, they will eat him alive. They have not forgotten the taste of human flesh, exclaimed Mornilonga. He was, in fact, the king of a tribe of man-eaters, that Masongo. It is only too true that in certain provinces of Central Africa cannibalism is still openly practiced. Livingstone states it in his Notes of Travel. On the borders of the Lualaba, the Maniamas not only eat the men killed in the wars, but they buy slaves to devour them, saying that human flesh is easily salted and needs little seasoning. Those cannibals Cameron has found again among the Monbonga, where they only feast on dead bodies after steeping them for several days in a running stream. Stanley has also encountered those customs of cannibalism among the inhabitants of the Aukansin. Cannibalism is evidently well spread among the tribes of the center. But cruel as was the kind of death proposed by the king for Dick Sand, it did not suit Negoro, who did not care to give up his victim. It was here, said he, that the white man killed our comrade. Harris. It is here that he ought to die, added Alves. Where you please, Alves, replied Mornilonga, but a drop of fire water for a drop of blood. Yes, replied the traitor, fire water, and you will see that it well merits that name. We shall make it blaze, this water. Jose Antonio Alves will offer a punch to the king Mornilonga. The drunkard shook his friend Alves's hands. He could not contain his joy. His wives, his courtiers shared his ecstasy. They had never seen brandy blaze, and doubtless they counted on drinking it all blazing. Then, after the thirst for alcohol, the thirst for blood, so imperious among these savages, would be satisfied also. Poor Dick Sand, what a horrible punishment awaited him. When we think of the terrible or grotesque effects of intoxication in civilized countries, we understand how far it can urge barbarous beings. We will readily believe that the thought of torturing a white could displease none of the natives, neither Jose Antonio Alves, a Negro like themselves, nor Coimbra, a mongrel of black blood, nor Negoro either, animated with a ferocious hatred against the whites. The evening had come, an evening without twilight, that was going to make day change to night almost at once, a propitious hour for the blazing of the brandy. It was truly a triumphant idea of Alves's, to offer a punch to this Negro majesty, and to make him love brandy under a new form. Mornilonga began to find that fire water did not sufficiently justify its name. Perhaps, blazing and burning, it would tickle more agreeably the blunted papillas of his tongue. The evening's program then comprised a punch first, a punishment afterwards. Dick Sand, closely shut up in his dark prison, would only come out to go to his death. The other slaves, sold or not, had been put back in the barracks. There only remained at the Tichitoka the traders, the overseers, and the soldiers ready to take their part of the punch, if the king and his court allowed them. Jose Antonio Alves, advised by Negoro, did the thing well. They brought a vast copper basin, capable of containing at least 200 pints, which was placed in the middle of the great place. Barrels holding alcohol of inferior quality, but well refined, were emptied into the basin. They spared neither the cinnamon, nor the allspice, nor any of the ingredients that might improve this punch for savages. All had made a circle around the king. Mornilonga advanced staggering to the basin. One would say that this vat of brandy fascinated him, and that he was going to throw himself into it. Alves generously held him back, and put a lighted match into his hand. "Fire!" cried he with a cunning grimace of satisfaction. "Fire!" replied Mornilonga, lashing the liquid with the end of the match. What a flare and what an effect, when the bluish flames played on the surface of the basin. Alves, doubtless to render that alcohol still sharper, had mingled with it a few handfuls of sea salt. The assistants' faces were then given that spectral lividness that the imagination ascribes to phantoms. Those Negroes, drunk in advance, began to cry out, to gesticulate, and, taking each other by the hand, formed an immense circle around the king of Kazonde. Alves, furnished with an enormous metal spoon, stirred the liquid, which threw a great white glare over those delirious monkeys. Mornilonga advanced. He seized the spoon from the trader's hands, plunged it into the basin, then, drawing it out full of punch and flames, he brought it to his lips. What a cry the king of Kazon then gave. An act of spontaneous combustion had just taken place. The king had taken fire like a petroleum bonbon. This fire developed little heat, but it devoured nonetheless. At this spectacle, the natives' dance was suddenly stopped. One of Moini Launga's ministers threw himself on his sovereign to extinguish him, but not less alcoholized than his master, he took fire in his turn. In this way, Moini Launga's whole court was in peril of burning up. Alves and Negoro did not know how to help his majesty. The women, frightened, had taken flight. As to Coimbra, he took his departure rapidly, well knowing his inflammable nature. The king and the minister, who had fallen on the ground, were burning up, a prey to frightful sufferings. In bodies so thoroughly alcoholized, combustion only produces a light and bluish flame that water cannot extinguish. Even stifled outside, it would still continue to burn inwardly. When liquor has penetrated all the tissues, there exists no means of arresting the combustion. A few minutes after, Morni Launga and his minister had succumbed, but they still burned. Soon, in the place where they had fallen, there was nothing left but a few light coals, one or two pieces of the vertebral column, fingers, toes, that the fire does not consume in cases of spontaneous combustion, but which it covers with an infectious and penetrating soot. It was all that was left of the king of Kazond and of his minister. Chapter 12. A Royal Burial. The next day, May 29th, the city of Kazond presented a strange aspect. The natives, terrified, kept themselves shut up in their huts. They had never seen a king, who said he was of divine essence, nor a simple minister, die of this horrible death. They had already burned some of their fellow beings, and the oldest could not forget certain culinary preparations relating to cannibalism. They knew then how the incineration of a human body takes place with difficulty, and behold, their king and his minister had burnt all alone. That seemed to them, and indeed ought to seem to them, inexplicable. José Antonio Alves kept still in his house. He might fear that he would be held responsible for the accident. Negoro had informed him of what had passed, warning him to take care of himself. To charge him with Moini Launga's death might be a bad affair, from which he might not be able to extricate himself without damage. But Negoro had a good idea. By his means, Alves spread the report that the death of Kazon's sovereign was supernatural, that the great Manitou only reserved it for his elect. The natives, so inclined to superstition, accepted this lie. The fire that came out of the bodies of the king and his minister became a sacred fire. They had nothing to do but honor Moini Launga by obsequies worthy of a man elevated to the rank of the gods. These obsequies, with all the ceremonial connected with them among the African tribes, was an occasion offered to Negoro to make Dick Sand play a part. What this death of Moini Launga was going to cost in blood would be believed with difficulty, if the Central Africa travelers, Lieutenant Cameron among others, had not related facts that cannot be doubted. The king of Kazon's natural heir was the Queen Moini. In proceeding without delay with the funeral ceremonies, she acted with sovereign authority, and could thus distance the competitors, among others that king of the Aukansin, who tended to encroach upon the rights of Kazon's sovereigns. Besides, Moini, even by becoming queen, avoided the cruel fate reserved for the other wives of the deceased. At the same time, she would get rid of the youngest ones, of whom she, first in date, had necessarily to complain. This result would particularly suit the ferocious temperament of that vixen. So she had it announced, with deer's horns and other instruments, that the obsequies of the defunct king would take place the next evening with all the usual ceremony. No protestation was made, neither at court nor from the natives. Alves and the other traders had nothing to fear from the accession of this Queen Moini. With a few presents, a few flattering remarks, they would easily subject her to their influence. Thus the royal heritage was transmitted without difficulty. There was terror only in the harem, and not without reason. The preparatory labors for the funeral were commenced the same day. At the end of the principal street of Kazond flowed a deep and rapid stream, an affluent of the Congo. The question was to turn this stream aside, so as to leave its bed dry. It was in that bed that the royal grave must be dug. After the burial, the stream would be restored to its natural channel. The natives were busily employed in constructing a dam that forced the stream to make a provisional bed across the plain of Kazond. At the last tableau of this funeral ceremony, the barricade would be broken, and the torrent would take its old bed again. Negoro intended Dick Sand to complete the number of victims sacrificed on the king's tomb. He had been a witness of the young novice's irresistible movement of anger when Harris had acquainted him with the death of Mrs. Weldon and little Jack. Negoro, cowardly rascal, had not exposed himself to the same fate as his accomplice. But now, before a prisoner firmly fastened by the feet and hands, he supposed he had nothing to fear and resolved to pay him a visit. Negoro was one of those miserable wretches who are not satisfied with torturing their victims. They must also enjoy their sufferings. Toward the middle of the day, then, he repaired to the barrack where Dick Sand was guarded, in sight of an overseer. There, closely bound, was lying the young novice, almost entirely deprived of food for 24 hours, weakened by past misery, tortured by those bands that entered into his flesh. Hardly able to turn himself, he was waiting for death, no matter how cruel it might be, as a limit to so many evils. However, at the sight of Negoro, he shuddered from head to foot. He made an instinctive effort to break the bands that prevented him from throwing himself on that miserable man and having revenge. But Hercules himself would not succeed in breaking them. He understood that it was another kind of contest that was going to take place between the two, and arming himself with calmness, Dick Sand compelled himself to look Negoro right in the face, and decided not to honor him with a reply, no matter what he might say. "I believed it to be my duty," Negoro said to him at first, "to come to salute my young captain for the last time, and to let him know how I regret, for his sake, that he does not command here any longer, as he commanded on board the Pilgrim." And, seeing that Dick Sand did not reply, "What, captain, do you no longer recognize your old cook? He comes, however, to take your orders, and to ask you what he ought to serve for your breakfast." At the same time, Negoro brutally kicked the young novice, who was lying on the ground. "Besides," added he, "I should have another question to address to you, my young captain. Could you yet explain to me how, wishing to land on the American coast, you have ended by arriving in Angola, where you are?" Certainly, Dick Sand had no more need of the Portuguese's words to understand what he had truly divined, when he knew at last that the Pilgrim's compass must have been made false by this traitor. But Negoro's question was an avowal. Still, he only replied by a contemptuous silence. "You will acknowledge, captain," continued Kegoro, "that it was fortunate for you that there was a seaman on board, a real one at that. Great God, where would we be without him? Instead of perishing on some breaker where the tempest would have thrown you, you have arrived, thanks to him, in a friendly port, and if it is to anyone that you owe being at last in a safe place, it is to that seaman whom you have wronged in despising, my young master." Speaking thus, Negoro, whose apparent calmness was only the result of an immense effort, had brought his form near Dick Sand. His face, suddenly become ferocious, touched him so closely that one would believe that he was going to devour him. This rascal could no longer contain his fury. "Every dog has his day," he exclaimed, in the paroxysm of fury excited in him by his victim's calmness. "Today I am captain, I am master, your life is in my hands." "Take it," Sand replied without emotion. "But know there is in heaven a God, avenger of all crimes, and your punishment is not distant. If God occupies himself with human beings, there is only time for him to take care of you." "I am ready to appear before the Supreme Judge," replied Dick Sand coldly, "and death will not make me afraid." "We shall see about that," howled Negoro. "You count on help of some kind, perhaps help at Kazonde, where Alves and I are all-powerful? You are a fool. You say to yourself, perhaps, that your companions are still there, that old Tom and the others. Undeceive yourself. It is a long time since they were sold and sent to Zanzibar, too fortunate if they do not die of fatigue on the way." "God has 1,000 ways of doing justice," replied Dick Sand. "The smallest instrument is sufficient for him. Hercules is free." "Hercules?" exclaimed Negoro, striking the ground with his foot. "He perished long ago under the lion's and panther's teeth. I regret only one thing, that is, that those ferocious beasts should have forestalled my vengeance." "If Hercules is dead," replied Dick Sand, "Dingo is alive. A dog like that, Negoro, is more than enough to take revenge on a man of your kind. I know you well, Negoro, you are not brave. Dingo will seek for you, it will know how to find you again. Some day you will die under his teeth." "Miserable boy," exclaimed the Portuguese, exasperated. "Miserable boy, Dingo died from a ball that I fired at it. It is dead, like Mrs. Weldon and her son, dead as all the survivors of the Pilgrim shall die." "And as you yourself shall die before long," replied Dick Sand, whose tranquil look made the Portuguese grow pale. Negoro, beside himself, was on the point of passing from words to deeds and strangling his unarmed prisoner with his hands. Already he had sprung upon him and was shaking him with fury when a sudden reflection stopped him. He remembered that he was going to kill his victim, that all would be over, and that this would spare him the 24 hours of torture he intended for him. He then stood up, said a few words to the overseer, standing impassive, commanded him to watch closely over the prisoner, and went out of the barrack. Instead of casting him down, this scene had restored all Dick Sand's moral force. His physical energy underwent a happy reaction, and at the same time regained the mastery. In bending over him in his rage, had Negoro slightly loosened the bands that, till then, had rendered all movement impossible. It was probable, for Dick Sand thought that his members had more play than before the arrival of his executioner. The young novice, feeling solaced, said to himself that perhaps it would be possible to get his arms free without too much effort. Guarded as he was, in a prison firmly shut, that would doubtless be only a torture, only a suffering less. But it was such a moment in life when the smallest good is invaluable. Certainly, Dick Sand hoped for nothing. No human succor could come to him except from outside, and whence could it come to him? He was then resigned. To tell the truth, he no longer cared to live. He thought of all those who had met death before him, and he only aspired to join them. Negoro had just repeated what Harris had told him. Mrs. Weldon and little Jack had succumbed. It was, indeed, only too probable that Hercules, exposed to so many dangers, must have perished also, and from a cruel death. Tom and his companions were at a distance, forever lost to him. Dick Sand ought to believe it. To hope for anything but the end of his troubles, by a death that could not be more terrible than his life, would be signal folly. He then prepared to die, above all throwing himself upon God, and asking courage from him to go on to the end without giving way. But thoughts of God are good and noble thoughts. It is not in vain that one lifts his soul to him who can do all, and when Dick Sand had offered his whole sacrifice, he found that, if one could penetrate to the bottom of his heart, he might perhaps discover there a last ray of hope. That glimmer which a breath from on high can change, in spite of all probabilities, into dazzling light. The hours passed away. Night came. The rays of light that penetrated through the thatch of the barrack gradually disappeared. The last noises of the Tichitoka, which during that day had been very silent after the frightful uproar of the night before, those last noises died out. Darkness became very profound in the interior of the narrow prison. Soon all reposed in the city of Kazonde. Dick Sand fell into a restoring sleep that lasted 2 hours. After that he awoke, still stronger. He succeeded in freeing one of his arms from their bands. It was already a little reduced, and it was a delight for him to be able to extend it and draw it back at will. The night must be half over. The overseer slept with heavy sleep, due to a bottle of brandy, the neck of which was still held in his shut hand. The savage had emptied it to the last drop. Dick Sand's first idea was to take possession of his jailer's weapons, which might be of great use to him in case of escape. But at that moment, he thought he heard a slight scratching at the lower part of the door of the barrack. Helping himself with his arms, he succeeded in crawling as far as the door sill without wakening the overseer. Dick Sand was not mistaken. The scratching continued, and in a more distinct manner. It seemed that from the outside someone was digging the earth under the door. Was it an animal? Was it a man? Hercules, if it were Hercules, the young novice said to himself. His eyes were fixed on his guard. He was motionless, and under the influence of a leaden sleep. Dick Sand, bringing his lips to the door sill, thought he might risk murmuring Hercules's name. A moan, like a low and plaintive bark, replied to him. "It is not Hercules," said Dick to himself, "but it is Dingo. He has scented me as far as this barrack. Should he bring me another word from Hercules? But if Dingo is not dead, Negoro has lied, and perhaps—" At that moment a paw passed under the door. Dick Sand seized it and recognized Dingo's paw, but if it had a letter, that letter could only be attached to its neck. What to do? Was it possible to make that hole large enough for Dingo to put in its head? At all events, he must try it. But hardly had Dick Sand begun to dig the soil with his nails, than barks that were not Dingo's sounded over the place. The faithful animal had just been scented by the native dogs, and doubtless could do nothing more than take to flight. Some detonations burst forth. The overseer half awoke. Dick Sand, no longer able to think of escaping, because the alarm was given, must then roll himself up again in his corner, and, after a lovely hope, he saw appear that day which would be without a tomorrow for him. During all that day, the gravediggers' labors were pushed on with briskness. A large number of natives took part, under the direction of Queen Moini's first minister. All must be ready at the hour named, under penalty of mutilation, for the new sovereign promised to follow the defunct king's ways, point by point. The waters of the brook having been turned aside, it was in the dry bed that the vast ditch was dug, to a depth of 10 feet, over an extent of 50 feet long by 10 wide. Toward the end of the day, they began to carpet it, at the bottom and along the walls, with living women, chosen among Moinilaunga's slaves. Generally, those unfortunates are buried alive. But on account of this strange and perhaps miraculous death of Moinilaunga, it had been decided that they should be drowned near the body of their master. One cannot imagine what those horrible hecatombs are, when a powerful chief's memory must be fitly honored among these tribes of Central Africa. Cameron says that more than 100 victims were thus sacrificed at the funeral ceremonies of the king of Kasongo's father. It is also the custom for the defunct king to be dressed in his most costly clothes before being laid in his tomb. But this time, as there was nothing left of the royal person except a few burnt bones, it was necessary to proceed in another manner. A willow mannequin was made, representing Moinilaunga sufficiently well, perhaps advantageously, and in it they shut up the remains the combustion had spared. The mannequin was then clothed with the royal vestments. We know that those clothes are not worth much, and they did not forget to ornament it with Cousin Benedict's famous spectacles. There was something terribly comic in this masquerade. The ceremony would take place with torches and with great pomp. The whole population of Kazond, native or not, must assist at it. When the evening had come, a long cortege descended the principal street, from the Tichatoka as far as the burial place. Cries, funeral dances, magicians' incantations, noises from instruments and detonations from old muskets from the arsenals, nothing was lacking in it. José Antonio Alves, Coimbra, Negoro, the Arab traders and their overseers had increased the ranks of Kazon's people. No one had yet left the great Laconi. Queen Moini would not permit it, and it would not be prudent to disobey the orders of one who was trying the trade of sovereign. The body of the king, laid in a palanquin, was carried in the last ranks of the cortege. It was surrounded by his wives of the second order, some of whom were going to accompany him beyond this life. Queen Moini, in great state, marched behind what might be called the catafalque. It was positively night when all the people arrived on the banks of the brook, but the resin torches, shaken by the porters, threw great bursts of light over the crowd. The ditch was seen distinctly. It was carpeted with black, living bodies, for they moved under the chains that bound them to the ground. 50 slaves were waiting there till the torrent should close over them. The majority were young natives, some resigned and mute, others giving a few groans. The wives, all dressed as for a fate, and who must perish, had been chosen by the queen. One of these victims, she who bore the title of second wife, was bent on her hands and knees to serve as a royal footstool, as she had done in the king's lifetime. The third wife came to hold up the mannequin, while the fourth lay at its feet, in the guise of a cushion. Before the mannequin, at the end of the ditch, a post, painted red, rose from the earth. To this post was fastened a white man, who was going to be counted also among the victims of these bloody obsequies. That white man was Dick Sand. His body, half naked, bore the marks of the tortures he had already suffered by Negoro's orders. Tied to this post, he waited for death like a man who has no hope except in another life. However, the moment had not yet arrived when the barricade would be broken. On a signal from the queen, the fourth wife, she who was placed at the king's feet, was beheaded by Kazon's executioner, and her blood flowed into the ditch. It was the beginning of a frightful scene of butchery. 50 slaves fell under the executioner's knife. The bed of the river ran waves of blood. During half an hour, the victims' cries mingled with the assistants' vociferations, and one would seek in vain, in that crowd, for a sentiment of repugnance or of pity. At last Queen Moini made a gesture, and the barricade that held back the upper waters gradually opened. By a refinement of cruelty, the current was allowed to filter down the river, instead of being precipitated by an instantaneous bursting open of the dam. Slow death instead of quick death. The water first drowned the carpet of slaves which covered the bottom of the ditch. Horrible leaps were made by those living creatures, who struggled against asphyxia. They saw Dick Sand, submerged to the knees, make a last effort to break his bonds. But the water mounted. The last heads disappeared under the torrent that took its course again, and nothing indicated that at the bottom of this river was dug a tomb, where 100 victims had just perished in honor of Kazon's king. The pen would refuse to paint such pictures, if regard for the truth did not impose the duty of describing them in their abominable reality. Man is still there, in those sad countries. To be ignorant of it is not allowable. Chapter 13. The interior of a factory. Harris and Negoro had told a lie in saying that Mrs. Weldon and little Jack were dead. She, her son, and cousin Benedict were then in Kazonde. After the assault on the anthill, they had been taken away beyond the camp on the Konza by Harris and Negoro, accompanied by a dozen native soldiers. A palanquin, the kitanda of the country, received Mrs. Weldon and little Jack. Why such care on the part of such a man as Negoro? Mrs. Weldon was afraid to explain it to herself. The journey from the Kaunza to Kazonde was made rapidly and without fatigue. Cousin Benedict, on whom trouble seemed to have no effect, walked with a firm step. As he was allowed to search to the right and to the left, he did not think of complaining. The little troop, then, arrived at Kazonde 8 days before Ibn Hamiz's caravan. Mrs. Weldon was shut up, with her child and cousin Benedict, in Alvez's establishment. Little Jack was much better. On leaving the marshy country where he had taken the fever, he gradually became better, and now he was doing well. No doubt neither he nor his mother could have borne the hardships of the caravan, but owing to the manner in which they had made this journey, during which they had been given a certain amount of care, they were in a satisfactory condition, physically at least. As to her companions, Mrs. Weldon had heard nothing of them. After having seen Hercules flee into the forest, she did not know what had become of him. As to Dick Sand, as Harris and Negoro were no longer there to torture him, she hoped that his being a white man would perhaps spare him some bad treatment. As to Nan, Tom, Bat, Austin, and Actaeon, they were blacks, and it was too certain that they would be treated as such. Poor people, who should never have trodden that land of Africa, and whom treachery had just cast there. When Ibn Hamiz's caravan had arrived at Kazonde, Mrs. Weldon, having no communication with the outer world, could not know of the fact. Neither did the noises from the Laconie tell her anything. She did not know that Tom and his friends had been sold to a trader from Ujiji, and that they would soon set out. She neither knew of Harris's punishment, nor of King Moinilaunga's death, nor of the royal funeral ceremonies that had added Dick Sand to so many other victims. So the unfortunate woman found herself alone at Kazonde, at the trader's mercy, in Negoro's power, and she could not even think of dying in order to escape him, because her child was with her. Mrs. Weldon was absolutely ignorant of the fate that awaited her. Harris and Negoro had not addressed a word to her during the whole journey from the Konza to Kazonde. Since her arrival, she had not seen either of them again, and she could not leave the enclosure around the rich trader's private establishment. Is it necessary to say now that Mrs. Weldon had found no help in her large child, cousin Benedict? That is understood. When the worthy savant learned that he was not on the American continent, as he believed, he was not at all anxious to know how that could have happened. No, his first movement was a gesture of anger. The insects that he imagined he had been the first to discover in America, those tsetsias and others, were only mere African hexapods, found by many naturalists before him, in their native places. Farewell, then, to the glory of attaching his name to those discoveries. In fact, as he was in Africa, what could there be astonishing in the circumstance that Cousin Benedict had collected African insects? But the first anger over, Cousin Benedict said to himself that the land of the Pharaohs, so he still called it, possessed incomparable entomological riches, and that so far as not being in the land of the Incas was concerned, he would not lose by the change. Ah, he repeated to himself, and even repeated to Mrs. Weldon, who hardly listened to him, this is the country of the manticores, those colopters with long hairy feet, with welded and sharp wing shells, with enormous mandibles, of which the most remarkable is the tuberculous manticore. It is the country of the calissomes with golden ends, of the Goliaths of Guinea and of the Gabon, whose feet are furnished with thorns, of the sacred Egyptian Atuchus, that the Egyptians of Upper Egypt venerated as gods. It is here that those sphinxes with heads of death, now spread over all Europe, belong, and also those Idias bigote, whose sting is particularly dreaded by the Senegalians of the coast. Yes, there are superb things to be found here, and I shall find them, if these honest people will only let me. We know who those honest people were, of whom Cousin Benedict did not dream of complaining. Besides, it has been stated, the entomologist had enjoyed a half-liberty in Negoro's and Harris's company, a liberty of which Dick Sand had absolutely deprived him during the voyage from the coast to the Conza. The simple-hearted savant had been very much touched by that condescension. Finally, Cousin Benedict would be the happiest of entomologists if he had not suffered a loss to which he was extremely sensitive. He still possessed his tin box, but his glasses no longer rested on his nose, his magnifying glass no longer hung from his neck. Now, a naturalist without his magnifying glass and his spectacles no longer exists. Cousin Benedict, however, was destined never to see those two optical attendants again, because they had been buried with the royal mannequin. So, when he found some insect, he was reduced to thrusting it into his eyes to distinguish its most prominent peculiarities. Ah, it was a great loss to Cousin Benedict, and he would have paid a high price for a pair of spectacles, but that article was not current on the Lacanus of Cazonde. At all events, Cousin Benedict could go and come in José Antonio Alves's establishment. They knew he was incapable of seeking to flee. Besides, a high palisade separated the factory from the other quarters of the city, and it would not be easy to get over it. But if it was well enclosed, this enclosure did not measure less than a mile in circumference. Trees, bushes of a kind peculiar to Africa, great herbs, a few rivulets, the thatch of the barracks, and the huts were more than necessary to conceal the continent's rarest insects, and to make Cousin Benedict's happiness, at least, if not his fortune. In fact, he discovered some hexapods, and nearly lost his eyesight in trying to study them without spectacles. But at least, he added to his precious collection, and laid the foundation of a great work on African entomology. If his lucky star would let him discover a new insect, to which he would attach his name, he would have nothing more to desire in this world. If Alves's establishment was sufficiently large for Cousin Benedict's scientific promenades, it seemed immense to little Jack, who could walk about there without restraint. But the child took little interest in the pleasures so natural to his age. He rarely quitted his mother, who did not like to leave him alone, and always dreaded some misfortune. Little Jack often spoke of his father, whom he had not seen for so long. He asked to be taken back to him. He inquired after all, for old Nan, for his friend Hercules, for Bat, for Austin, for Actaeon, and for Dingo that appeared indeed to have deserted him. He wished to see his comrade, Dick Sand, again. His young imagination was very much affected, and only lived in those remembrances. To his questions, Mrs. Weldon could only reply by pressing him to her heart, while covering him with kisses. All that she could do was not to cry before him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Weldon had not failed to observe that, if bad treatment had been spared her during the journey from the Conza, nothing in Alves's establishment indicated that there would be any change of conduct in regard to her. There were in the factory only the slaves in the trader's service. All the others, which formed the object of his trade, had been penned up in the barracks of the Tichitoka, then sold to the brokers from the interior. Now, the storehouses of the establishment were overflowing with stuffs and ivory. The stuffs were intended to be exchanged in the provinces of the center, the ivory to be exported from the principal markets of the continent. In fact, then there were few people in the factory. Mrs. Weldon and Jack occupied a hut apart, Cousin Benedict another. They did not communicate with the trader's servants. They ate together. The food, consisting of goat's flesh or mutton, vegetables, tapioca, sorgo, and the fruits of the country, was sufficient. Halima, a young slave, was especially devoted to Mrs. Weldon's service. In her way, and as she could, she even evinced for her a kind of savage, but certainly sincere, affection. Mrs. Weldon hardly saw José Antonio Alves, who occupied the principal house of the factory. She did not see Negoro at all, as he lodged outside, but his absence was quite inexplicable. This absence continued to astonish her, and make her feel anxious at the same time. What does he want? What is he waiting for? She asked herself. Why has he brought us to Cazonde? So had passed the 8 days that preceded and followed the arrival of Ibn Hamiz's caravan. That is, the 2 days before the funeral ceremonies, and the 6 days that followed. In the midst of so many anxieties, Mrs. Weldon could not forget that her husband must be a prey to the most frightful despair, on not seeing either his wife or his son return to San Francisco. Mr. Weldon could not know that his wife had adopted that fatal idea of taking passage on board the Pilgrim, and he would believe that she had embarked on one of the steamers of the Trans-Pacific Company. Now, these steamers arrived regularly, and neither Mrs. Weldon, nor Jack, nor Cousin Benedict were on them. Besides, the Pilgrim itself was already overdue at San Francisco. As she did not reappear, James W. Weldon must now rank her in the category of ships supposed to be lost, because not heard of. What a terrible blow for him, when news of the departure of the Pilgrim and the embarkation of Mrs. Weldon should reach him from his correspondence in Auckland. What had he done? Had he refused to believe that his son and she had perished at sea? But then, where would he search? Evidently on the Isles of the Pacific, perhaps on the American coast. But never, no never, would the thought occur to him that she had been thrown on the coast of this fatal Africa. So thought Mrs. Weldon. But what could she attempt? Flee? How? She was closely watched. And then to flee was to venture into those thick forests in the midst of 1,000 dangers, to attempt a journey of more than 200 miles to reach the coast. And meanwhile Mrs. Weldon was decided to do it, if no other means offered themselves for her to recover her liberty. But first, she wished to know exactly what Negoro's designs were. At last she knew them. On the 6th of June, 3 days after the burial of Kazon's king, Negoro entered the factory, where he had not yet set foot since his return. He went right to the hut occupied by his prisoner. Mrs. Weldon was alone. Cousin Benedict was taking one of his scientific walks. Little Jack, watched by the slave Halima, was walking in the enclosure of the establishment. Negoro pushed open the door of the hut without knocking. "Mrs. Weldon," said he, "Tom and his companions have been sold for the markets of Aujiji." "May God protect them," said Mrs. Weldon, shedding tears. "Nan died on the way, Dick Sand has perished." "Nan dead and Dick," cried Mrs. Weldon. "Yes, it is just for your captain of 15 to pay for Harris's murder with his life," continued Negoro. "You are alone in Kazond, mistress. Alone, in the power of the Pilgrim's old cook, absolutely alone, do you understand?" What Negoro said was only too true, even concerning Tom and his friends. The old black man, his son Bat, Actaeon and Austin had departed the day before with the trader of Aujiji's caravan, without the consolation of seeing Mrs. Weldon again, without even knowing that their companion in misery was in Kazond, in Alvaz's establishment. They had departed for the lake country, a journey figured by hundreds of miles, that very few accomplish, and from which very few return. "Well," murmured Mrs. Weldon, looking at Negoro without answering. "Mrs. Weldon," returned the Portuguese, in an abrupt voice, "I could revenge myself on you for the bad treatment I suffered on board the Pilgrim. But Dick Sand's death will satisfy my vengeance. Now, mistress, I become the merchant again, and behold my projects with regard to you." Mrs. Weldon looked at him without saying a word. "You," continued the Portuguese, "your child, and that imbecile who runs after the flies, you have a commercial value which I intend to utilize. So I am going to sell you." "I am of a free race," replied Mrs. Weldon in a firm tone. "You are a slave if I wish it." "And who would buy a white woman?" "A man who will pay for her whatever I shall ask him." Mrs. Weldon bent her head for a moment, for she knew that anything was possible in that frightful country. "You have heard," continued Negoro. "Who is this man to whom you will pretend to sell me?" replied Mrs. Weldon. "To sell you or to resell you, at least I suppose so," added the Portuguese, sneering. "The name of this man?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "This man, he is James W. Weldon, your husband." "My husband?" exclaimed Mrs. Weldon, who could not believe what she had just heard. "Himself, Mrs. Weldon, your husband, to whom I do not wish simply to restore his wife, his child, and his cousin, but to sell them, and at a high price." Mrs. Weldon asked herself if Negoro was not setting a trap for her. However, she believed he was speaking seriously. To a wretch to whom money is everything, it seems that we can trust when business is in question. Now, this was business. "And when do you propose to make this business operation?" returned Mrs. Weldon. "As soon as possible." "Where?" "Just here. Certainly James Weldon will not hesitate to come as far as Kazond for his wife and son." "No, he will not hesitate, but who will tell him?" I shall go to San Francisco to find James Weldon. I have money enough for this voyage." "The money stolen from on board the Pilgrim?" "Yes, that and more besides," replied Negoro insolently. "But if I wish to sell you soon, I also wish to sell you at a high price. I think that James Weldon will not regard $100,000." He will not regard them if he can give them, replied Mrs. Weldon coldly. Only my husband, to whom you will say, doubtless, that I am held a prisoner at Kazonde in Central Africa. Precisely. My husband will not believe you without proofs, and he will not be so imprudent as to come to Kazonde on your word alone. He will come here, returned Negoro, if I bring him a letter written by you, which will tell him your situation, which will describe me as a faithful servant escaped from the hands of these savages. My hand shall never write that letter, Mrs. Weldon replied in a still colder manner. You refuse, exclaimed Negoro. I refuse. The thought of the dangers her husband would pass through in coming as far as Kazonde, the little dependence that could be placed on the Portuguese's promises, the facility with which the latter could retain James Weldon, after taking the ransom agreed upon, all these reasons taken together made Mrs. Weldon refuse Negoro's proposition flatly and at once. Mrs. Weldon spoke, thinking only of herself, forgetting her child for the moment. You shall write that letter, continued the Portuguese. No, replied Mrs. Weldon again.